Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Public Voices. I'm Nicole.
And I'm Doug. Hey, everybody. We are so happy to be with you today. And today's conversation is one that literally all of you can relate to workplace communication. We're going to focus today on how to navigate those difficult conversations and have some productive meetings and how leaders can clearly communicate in those always high stressful environments.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that whether you work in HR or public safety or finance or city administration, this topic applies to everyone.
Absolutely, without question. So before we jump in, though, quick thank you to our sponsor, NEOGOV, who helps make this podcast possible. So are we ready to dive in?
Of course. So, one of the things that I learned in HR is that a lot of problems that you have with employees aren't related to policies or, unclear job roles. It's more related to having poor communication. So, misunderstandings, assumptions, avoidance of issues, all of those can grow quickly in organizations.
Oh, yeah, you can't believe it. This always happens. And in policing and public safety, kind of my specialty, communication can affect morale. It can affect trust within an organization, and ultimately, it can even affect how people feel safe within the organization, just to even go do their job or what they feel like as a public servant. And if they don't feel informed or respected, we know what they're going to do. They're going to fill in the blanks, and usually, it's not going to be a positive thing.
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite topics. I call that storytelling. When employees don't have all the information they need, they fill in the gaps and create a really, really great, elaborate story in their head, most of which is usually not very accurate. So that's always fun to address as a leader. But I think, we can talk today about how we prevent stories and make sure that when we're communicating things to employees, we're giving them clarity so they don't have to do that. They don't have to fill in the blanks.
Yeah. So what's the game that you're sitting in a big circle and you say something to somebody to your left or to your right, whichever way,
Mm.
and you have a
Telephone.
message. That's it, a telephone game.
Yeah,
And so by
yeah,
the time it gets all the way around back to you originally, the message that was originally stated is like nothing at all
right.
like what finally comes out. And that's one of the challenges. And that's what people do. They fill in the blanks just like you said. And that's exactly where the leadership piece really matters. I feel like people can handle difficult messages much better than
Mm,
they can the silence or the absence of any kind of message that's sort of just not feeling real to them. And I think
yeah,
that communication piece is so important there.
yeah, absolutely. I know that you've referenced Brene Brown before in this quote, but I think it really applies to what we're talking about today, which is clear is kind and unclear is unkind. And so essentially that phrase reminds us that vague communication really can damage relationships at work and really, really have a negative impact on the organization.
Yeah, that's a great quote, and thanks for bringing that up. I love her book, Dare to Lead. Anything by Brene Brown
Mhm.
in my book. Not that
Yeah,
I have a book, but if I
superstar.
had a book, I would say Brene Brown is great in my book. So
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of supervisors just kind of push off those difficult conversations because they just don't want to deal with the conflict, and avoiding it though generally makes it worse. And we all know the type of people that you become a supervisor, and the change from kind of a line level to a supervisor level really creates some challenges because once you're working with the same group of people and then you're leading them, and you start to have those tough conversations, and it's human nature, right? They're just uncomfortable to have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've seen this all the time in the HR world where leaders avoid small things because they're genuinely afraid to have hard conversations, whether that's, they're afraid to say what's going on and be direct, they're afraid of the reaction that's coming. But regardless, avoiding that conversation is not the right thing to do because it just grows and grows into bigger problems.
Yeah, I can give you a specific example from my younger years as a aspiring police leader, and I took the
Mm,
sergeant's promotional process. This has been a minute or two. And I took the test, and I think I scored like an 82, which is pretty good out of 100. Just so our listeners know, it's not like out of 200. I wasn't that bad, but an 82 is a B, right? Not bad. And so I did all right. And I went afterwards. Everybody got scored. I didn't get promoted, and so I went to HR in this case because they were over the testing process. Everybody in the police department was taken out of it, and I was given the feedback of I said, "Well, what can I do better?" I got an 82, but what can I do to improve upon my score? Like what did I do poorly? What did I do
Mhm,
well on? What areas could I study and things like that? And I was told an answer that really stayed with me for a long time. It was like, we can't tell you, and
mhm,
we can't give you any feedback. And I'm like, well, how do I improve? And said, well,
mhm,
just do better next time. And I'm thinking, well, but what do I study? And to me, that felt, it was a little harsh. I
mhm.
mean, I got an 82, so I deserved an 82, but how can I help and really try and improve myself to just try and do better inside? And I know that officers, especially in public safety, anybody in the public safety field just prefers honesty. And even if you don't love the conversation, you at least appreciate knowing where you stand. And in that case, I didn't know where I stood, and it just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and I think, like you said, how do you know how to get better when you don't know the specifics, right? And I think one thing that leaders can do to help, um, calm their fears with having those hard conversations, or even in that situation, you were soliciting feedback, it didn't need to be a hard conversation, is to really focus on the behavior or the performance and not the person. And so let's talk about what went wrong in the process, or what we could do to make sure that you feel confident and trained versus saying, hey, you're not a detail oriented person and you made all these mistakes, right?
Yeah. Or yeah, and the worst thing that you can hear is like, "Well, you're just not ready yet."
How?
If it's
Why?
promotion, what's that mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it's so, subjective and those kinds of things. So yeah, I think
Right.
you're spot on with that.
Yeah,
It,
absolutely.
yeah, it's
Oh, go
funny.
ahead.
I worked with another HR department at another organization, and after the promotional process, this time, totally different organization, different place, different state,
Hmm.
and that HR department took it upon themselves to actually sit down with each candidate afterwards to say, you know, here's what we think we can help kind of walk alongside you to help you improve upon, and here's some areas for improvement. And to me, that was so much more of a kind of a complete full process that
Hmm.
I think it's that much more helpful. It's like they're explaining the specific issue,
Hmm.
in terms of what the challenge is, what that person is looking at, but that clarity is so helpful, and that impact it has on the person, I think, is tremendous.
And I'm curious, going into that conversation, did you feel like nervous to receive the feedback, or were you open to it because, again, you are a leader that wanted to be better?
I think I was always open to it because I just wanted to know what the answer was. And I'm the kind of
Yeah.
person, if you know me, I don't want you to, if we have an issue and Nicole and Doug have some sort of an issue, and there's something that I do that you're like, I'm not really fond of that. I would rather you come to me and, for example, for feedback, just say, hey, you did this or you said this and I don't really love it.
Mhm.
And here's kind of my perspective on that. I would much prefer that 10 times out of 10 versus if you just kind of let it fester and harbor
Absolutely.
this feeling of something. I'm much more of an upfront person and just we deal with it head on. And it may be something I didn't realize that I said it a certain way or a tone or a context.
Mhm.
And I'm like, okay, thanks for bringing it to me because it takes a little bit of bravery to
Yeah.
do that. But also it helps us resolve that situation that much faster. So I'm all about that kind of feedback.
Yeah, clear as kind, right?
Clear
I
as kind.
think when you talk about, just general issues with employees or with relationships, I like using the analogy of a carton of strawberries and how when there's a little mold on one strawberry, if you don't address that strawberry and take it out, that grows, right? Very, very quickly. So when you're specifically talking about something like not giving feedback for performance, that impacts your work group, that impacts that employee very, very quickly. And you kind of have to throw the whole carton of strawberries out, right? And so it's how can we be clear and avoid that rot when we're giving feedback to employees? So, yeah, I think it's always great to have that environment in your work group so that employees feel comfortable giving and receiving feedback.
Yeah, I think it's great. And I've never really considered it that, but it's a logical thing that we deal with all the time. The carton of strawberries or whatever fruit
Mhm.
you happen to love,
Yep.
if you don't deal with that immediately. And I'm curious about, you've been in HR a long time and you've seen a lot of things. It's not fun to deal with some of these issues sometimes when you have to give what feels like negative, feedback. But how did you overcome that and how did you get good at it?
Yeah, I think you get good at it with repetition, right? With practice. And unfortunately, you just have to start somewhere. But I think one thing that I always would give leaders direction on is if I was going into a really hard conversation, I would jot down an outline just so I didn't hit the high points because your nerves can kind of take over. Maybe the employee can be emotional or defensive. And so you want to just kind of keep yourself on topic and get back to, hey, we're here to talk about the process of, you made some errors, sorry, errors in payroll. Let's figure that out. But yeah, it is very challenging, but the more that we do it, the more comfortable we get with ourselves, knowing that we can have that difficult conversation. Difficult conversations never get easy, right? That is not something that anyone enjoys doing. But you just get more confident with your ability to navigate those conversations.
Agreed. 100%.
Yeah. So let's talk about being having good communication in meetings. Have you ever sat through a painful meeting?
No, in policing, I've never once sat through a painful meeting in
I
all of my
find that
time.
hard to believe.
You are
Um,
probably spot on with that assessment.
but I think, when we talk about really basic things, and, in our last episode, we talked about building trust. A very simple thing that employees are always paying attention to is, are we holding efficient and productive meetings? And so how do we do that?
Yeah, I think it's having a purpose. And you've sat through a number of meetings. I've sat through a number of meetings. Our listeners, our viewers have sat through a million. They might be sitting through a meeting right now with earbuds on, watching this instead of their meeting. It's very
Mhm.
possible this could be happening. So we want to hear from you if you're doing this because we'll send you something nice. But I think we don't have meetings just to have meetings. You want to have a purpose. You want to have clarity as to why we're all here today. Like, are we going to make some decision on something? Where do we stand with a project? Are we going to talk about something that affects our agency or our community, or are we trying to solve some sort of issue that's been brought up immediately? Like, what are we doing this for? And then that can kind of set the stage, if you will, for when
Yeah.
people come into the meeting, so they know really what to expect.
Yeah, and I think it's super important to be respectful of people's time, right? If something that we're working on could be in an email, then it should be in an email. We shouldn't get high executives together for an hour to just have a very small conversation that could have just been in a quick 5-minute email.
Yeah. How many times have you walked out of a meeting and said, "This could have been an email"?
Yeah, I had a
Yeah.
ribbon on my bulletin board that said this could have been an email.
See, that's why there are ribbons like that. That's exactly the
Yeah.
reason.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
from the public safety side, and then probably the same as your side on the HR side, it's just when you have some information to get out, you want to make it as concise and actionable as possible. And in briefings, for example, when we show up and officers show up to the next shift, or dispatchers, or whomever else are showing up to a shift, there's only a limited amount of time to get out so much information that's really important, things to watch for, things that are happening, all those types of events that we have in police briefings. And that communication has to be concise and it has to be actionable. And people lose focus very, very quickly otherwise. So, like, just get to the point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think productive meetings definitely need a clear agenda. We need to have the right people in the room. Um, we should really have clearly defined next steps. So, is there any homework? Who's doing the homework? What is the deadline? And then, reviewing those action items as you wrap up the meeting so we don't forget. Because I think depending on what committee you're on, some people just allow one or two people to take on all the responsibility of whatever's happening. And so we need to kind of spread the wealth and say, you're doing this homework, you're doing this, I'll take this, and just kind of doing that wrap up so everyone is on the same page.
Yeah, that is such an important point. I'm glad you brought it up because without walking away with knowing what those next steps are, we totally lose focus. And sometimes people will walk down the hall after a meeting like, am I supposed to do something? Like, what am
Right.
I supposed to do with this? And that's where the follow-up and the importance of the follow-up really comes into place. People, they communicate differently, they understand, they hear things differently. And so when you leave a meeting and everybody has different interpretations about what's happening, unless those expectations are lined out, okay, Larry, when we finish this meeting, within a week, I need this brought back, or Jessica, I need this done, and we all good on. Are we on the same page? Let's kind of recap. Let's walk away from it. And I think if the facilitator of that meeting, whoever's leading it, and whatever role they happen to be, has those types of follow ups, and then shares, even doubling down on that, shares something out virtually, like an email or something, whatever it happens to be, just to kind of say, remember, this is what we walked away with. These are the due dates. These are the people assigned, and let's get back together. I just think it makes it more efficient.
Absolutely. And I love a paper trail, so sending out, your notes and who's doing what. And I also think too, depending on the gap in between the meetings, employees might forget what they were assigned. And so having those notes to reference later and say, "Oh, I forgot to do my homework. This is what it is." That's super helpful too. And I think in meetings, it's really, really important for all leaders to be open to what employees have to say, whether they're in a leadership role or they're a frontline employee. We need to be able to create an environment where everyone feels free to share their ideas or their thoughts, because the best ideas kind of can come out of nowhere from someone that it's unexpected.
Yeah, you are so spot on with that. I had the opportunity to lead a few agencies. And when one of those agencies, every time budget would come around, we would solicit feedback from every employee to say, hey, look, first of all, this isn't a, choose everything, go on Amazon and put everything on your wish list kind of thing and get it. But this is the why of the budget. This is what we do. This is how we're going to plan it out. But you're the frontline workers. I'm not the one out at 2 a.m. on the streets trying to do the job. I'm not the one sitting in dispatch trying to answer multiple calls and get emergency services dispatched out to it. So I don't have that sort of knowledge base anymore to really do that effectively. So you tell me what you want and then let's kind of triage that or rank that as we look into budget to say here's our needs. But to your exact point, it comes from the people doing the work.
Mhm.
And sometimes I think as managers, we miss that altogether, and that can be really challenging. And for us in policing, it's huge. If people don't feel safe enough to bring those types of things up internally, imagine imagine what we could lose potentially with something like it could be an officer safety equipment issue, it could be a communications issue, but something that can very much change how we do things to provide the services that we, whether it's police or fire or EMS or whatever it happens to be. Those critical moments really do matter, and unless you're hearing from the people that are doing the work, probably missing out on something.
Yeah, I think that's a really great example of allowing employees to use their voice and then getting buy-in, because budget is such a touchy subject with employees, especially when they don't understand why decisions were made, why things were added or cut. And so having kind of that open process and soliciting those ideas is a really cool way to include them in that process.
Yeah.
Um, Speaking of budgets, communication can, become really important during high stress times. So, budget cuts, operational changes, maybe restructures in the organization, or even during critical incidents.
Yeah, it's tricky, and so we went from having budgets to budget cuts, so thanks for that change, but it's the reality, right? I mean, that
Right.
we live in a world where we don't have infinite pots of money in the public sector. We have taxpayers who put in money to a city or a county or local unit of government, and they're expected to use that money wisely and intentionally and with purpose. So, it's not an unlimited amount of resource, and so those budgets have to be very carefully utilized, and when there's cuts, that's where we get to see some challenges. And I think during those times, and you mentioned critical incidents, you mentioned about restructuring, a new chief comes in, a new leader comes in, whatever that happens to look like. That's when leaders get watched the most. And I
Mhm.
think that's where there's a higher level of expectation during those more stressful times where people think that people don't pay attention sometimes about organizations. The opposite is true, and you and I know this.
Yes.
People watch everything. They listen to everything. They scrutinize every email because they're wanting to read into or see things. And so as leaders, it's not important. It's not just important that we say something, but it's how we say that really is, I think, so critical to how we message and how we lead with that consistency and that fairness.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in my organization, it was always kind of a reminder to employees that the public was watching. And we talked about that all the time that whether you're on duty or off duty, public, citizens are watching you. But we never really talked about how our employees are watching us or how other leaders are watching and kind of critiquing or second guessing our decisions. And so, yes, I think that's so important. And I think it's important too that we acknowledge that employees don't necessarily expect leaders to have the right answer and be perfect throughout. But it's more just, will you be honest with me? Will you be transparent and share what's going on, and share what's happening in the future? Because, as we talked about earlier, those stories start unfolding when we don't share that information.
Yeah, and one of the worst things that we can do is just not say anything. We touched on a little bit earlier with the lack of when there's lack of information, people will fill it, and that silence really does truly create rumors. And it also, I think, really kind of brings out the need to be consistent in how we address those types of things. And if I speak as a chief in front of a neighborhood watch group versus speaking in front of a briefing group or versus a city council, and how I change and communicate, even though it'll be a little different because of the audience. But if the context of what I'm saying and the content is different significantly, then mixed messages are created. And I think that's really, really challenging. So we have to be consistent. The message will sound a little different
Yes.
based on who you're talking to, just because that's just the way that works. But the context and the key takeaways should absolutely remain the same throughout. And so I think that transparency, that consistency is super important.
Yeah, and I think, when you talk about being consistent and having those messages regardless of your audience, it's really important for leaders to be vulnerable and be able to share. I don't have all the answers yet, or that's a great question. Let me look into it, versus maybe making something up or sharing, well, I can't tell you that, right? It's just saying, I don't know the answers right now, but let me look into it and I'll get back to you. And that's okay.
Yeah. And then making sure you get back to them. Right,
Absolutely.
not just
Yeah.
saying it and then
Yeah.
walking out thinking, "Whew, glad I'm done with that," but
Right.
actually following up to your exact point, getting back with them is key.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So we've had a really interesting discussion on communication today, and I'd love to just leave the listeners with a few takeaways that we, discuss. So mine from this conversation would be one, being clear. Clear is kind. We don't want to create an opportunity for our employees to fill in those gaps and tell stories. And so, regardless of if it's an email or if it's in a conversation, just making sure that we're sharing all the information that we can so that they don't fill in with those negative contexts. Um, Number 2 is hard conversations never get easy, right? But we get better with those repetitions as we go on and as we build confidence in ourselves. And then my third takeaway is just having those action items after each meeting and then making sure that we do follow up with those involved and those who have homework. Did you
Yeah,
have
those are
any takeaways?
I do, and I'm gonna
Oh,
build off your
perfect.
clear as who knew, right? So you mentioned clear as kind, and I agree with you 100%, and I think that clarity, to take it a step further, that's what builds the trust within organizations. When it's like you said, it's tough delivering the message, but when you're clear with people, and I don't mean rude or anything like that, I just mean the clarity of the message to say, "Look, here's the situation, and here's how I think we can move forward, or we can do something different," or whatever it happens to be. I think that clarity really does build that trust. I really also think my second one would be don't avoid the tough conversations because you're just going to let it grow. You gave the strawberry example earlier. If you let that strawberry mold and it's with a bunch of other strawberries just hanging out, all those strawberries are going to go bad. And that's the same way with information and within a police agency or whatever public sector agency. The things are going to go bad very quickly, and you'll see the fruits of that. And no pun
Mhm.
intended, I guess.
Yeah.
And
You're
then
so good with
last,
puns.
well, here we are, right? So,
I love it.
and then lastly, I would just say communicate with consistency and with purpose, and that's not just during routine things; it's also during those high tense, stressful situations that we deal with all the time. You're whether you're in HR and you're dealing with budget cuts and challenges and it benefits time and figuring those out to do the best thing you can for the city or county, or whether you're in policing and you're dealing with some sort of critical incident. I mean, those stressful situations come up, but we have to communicate consistently throughout that whole time. So don't stop just during the normal times.
Mhm.
Maintain that presence and maintain that direction during the stressful times too.
Yeah. Those are really great takeaways. And I think, to summarize your takeaways and mine, I think, overall, the goal of communication is to not be perfect, but it's to have intention and make sure that we are doing our best to get the message out versus almost being secretive with what's happening in the organization.
Yeah, and in the public sector, good communications, not just about productivity to make sure everybody's doing what they're doing, but it's also about building trust. It's about morale, and it is about serving the people that we serve well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, thanks for joining Public Voices, and thanks again to our sponsor, NeoGov, the leading HR software provider for the public sector, for supporting our conversations.
And be sure to follow and stream wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to rate us.
And again, we hope that today's discussion gave you something to think about and bring back to your team. And if there's anything that you would like us to chat about or you have questions on, please let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
We would indeed. So, till next time, we'll keep the conversation going and same time next week. See you then. Thank you.
Bye.